Da-da-da-da-da-da, don't sue us. We're here for This Week in Law. With me, Denise Howell. We're here with Evan Brown, Nilay Patel, and Matt Macari. We've got a suit that tweets, democracy, and all that stuff. Apple versus Samsung, and Danah Boyd getting her Tumblr handle back next on TWiL.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is TWiT.
Bandwidth for This Week in Law is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is TWiL, This Week in Law with Denise Howell, episode 109, recorded April 29, 2011, Taco Suits. This episode of This Week in Law is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies streamed to your PC, Mac, or TV instantly. Plus, get DVDs by mail in about one business day. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. And by Trim Tonic. Trim Tonic is a natural appetite suppressant tonic that takes the edge off being hungry. Enter your coupon code TWIT for a 20% discount at Trim Tonic. That's TRIMTONIQ.com. Hello, and I'm Denise Howell, and you have joined us for This Week in Law, episode 109. Thanks so much for joining us. We've got a great panel of folks to talk about the latest developments in technology law, starting with Nilay Patel from This Is My Next. Hi, Nilay.
Hey, how's it going? Thanks for having me back.
It's great to have you back. Also joining us is Matt Macari from Some IP Law. Hi, Matt.
Hi, how's it going?
Going great. Wonderful to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to be here again.
And also joining us again is Evan Brown from InternetCases.com and Hinshaw and Culbertson in Chicago. Hello, Evan.
Hey, good afternoon. It's great to see you. Happy Friday. Looking forward to this conversation.
Happy Friday. Happy Royal Wedding Day, or day where we can all witness the royal wedding.
Right, and, think about the American Revolution.
Well, no, explain. Oh, because...
Well,
we
right.
no longer...
Our friend Ben Snitkoff put up a great tweet this morning. He's been on the show a few times, and he was talking about how people had brought donuts to work to celebrate the royal wedding. And he says, we fought a war over this, folks. So here we are.
All these trappings of royalty. Well, I trotted out my funny hats for the occasion because that was my favorite part of the wedding coverage, was all the funny hats. So,
right on.
Love those Brits and their headgear. All right. Well, we last week did our show, The Other Pump Drops, about the Apple suit against Samsung. So yet another pump dropped, and Samsung, of course, as we knew they would, countersued Apple. And Nilay, you had sort of the definitive post on the Apple suit, and we're waiting with bated breath at the end of it for what Samsung's response was going to be. So now we have it. Why don't you give us your reaction to it?
Well, it's really interesting. Tim Cook on their financial results call said, we've been talking to Samsung for some time. We couldn't resolve the issues. Now we have to rely on the court. And you can tell that Samsung was sort of primed to respond to this lawsuit. They filed almost within a week. Within the week, they filed 3 lawsuits in Korea, Tokyo, and Germany. And then yesterday, they filed a countersuit in the Northern District of California alleging 10 patents, 7 that are on 3G stuff, and 3 that are on user interface. What's interesting, I think, is that they didn't file the reply yet to Apple's suit. So it's almost like, Apple pulled the trigger, Samsung said, well, we're ready to sue you right back, and they sue them right back. But they haven't yet acknowledged, Apple's suit. And, you don't need to put the reply and the countersuit together, and I think it's kind of interesting that Samsung was ready with these countersuits, but they had a week. I don't know if they could have done the reply in that time, but they didn't do it. So what's also interesting to me is that nobody has seen these 3 other filings in Korea, Japan, and Germany. So Samsung says they filed. I don't know anybody who's seen them or reported on them or says what the patents in them are. The 10 that are here, I'm looking at them. There'll be a post on This Is My Next later today. They're very, very technical, the 7 patents on UMTS. It's all about radio frames and data transmission and really nitty-gritty stuff. underlying it is sort of the idea that 3G is governed by a standards body, and Samsung is required to license at least some of these patents as a member of the standards body under fair and reasonable terms. But their complaint doesn't indicate which of these patents might be, mandatory under any sort of mandatory licensing scheme. So there's a lot here to unpack. And yet to come is Samsung's reply to Apple's actual trademark trade dress patent claims. And so that'll happen next. And, my expectation, I'm sure you guys probably agree, is that all this will end up being consolidated into one monster case instead of these, several different proceedings.
What do you think about that, Matt? First of all, have you seen any of the things in Japan, Korea, and Germany, or know of anybody who has?
No, just the reports that they've been filed. Within 2 days they were filed. It's actually crazy that they were able to. Obviously, they had something put together beforehand to get something filed this quickly. I was going to ask Nilay if he knows what jurisdiction this Samsung case was in, because I'm forgetting right now.
The U.S. one is Northern District of California. And that's Apple and Samsung had filed both in there. So
so that's obviously it'll make it easy to decide whether they're going to consolidate it. But it is pretty crazy to get these things filed this quickly. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Samsung had an extension to file their counterclaims in the case that Apple initiated. So to have this thing filed so quickly, because whether or not it takes much time to put these things together as far as a physical complaint, the due diligence you're supposed to do to get there has to take some time, and either they were working 24/7 or they had this thing ready already.
Well, it's 10 patents, and Samsung's patent portfolio, which they disclose, is 28,700 U.S. patents, 5,700 telecommunications patents. So to go through and pick the 10 they're going to claim, that's months of work, right? I mean, at the outset, that's months of work. So I do think that they were ready for the prospect of litigation throughout their discussions with Apple. And I think we're seeing the fruits of that labor in the fact that they can do this so quickly.
Yeah, and on the substantive side, this is looking at Apple's case against Samsung, and you did a great article, Nilay. You sure you're not a patent attorney?
I'm not a patent attorney. I have a lot of friends. That's all I can say.
Yeah, no, it was great. It's very concise and but yet still gets into the details. It's a litigator's and a patent litigator's dream to have a case. First of all, with design patents in it, because I think the misconception out there is design patents are very narrow and have no force. But there's a lot of wiggle room in how these are interpreted and how they're enforced against defendants, and to have something that's a relatively close knockoff that you can go after with what I see as very good design patents as far as scope. Whether they're valid, we'll find out, but the scope of them, with the way they've dashed out lines and really focused in on certain features, is very important, and it provides a nice story for Apple to tell during litigation. It has a lot to do with look and feel, whereas Samsung has come back with patents that just put juries and judges to sleep with regard to the technicalities of Wi-Fi and 3G. And I mean, there's some of that built into Apple's case as well with some of the utility patents. But if you look at just the general overall feel of the litigation, it really is going after this aesthetic quality of the iOS. And that's something that's much easier for Apple to get through to a judge and a jury, and I'm not sure if this has been mentioned before, bringing in those design patents automatically statutorily gives Apple a chance to go after Samsung's lost profits rather than just developing a normal kind of reasonable royalty model for damages. So that can be a huge upside for Apple, at least as they initiated their own suit.
Well, in Samsung's case, among its 28,000 patents, did it simply not have the design patents to be able to fight back with those? What do you think, Nilay?
I don't know. I can't say I've done an exhaustive survey of Samsung's patent portfolio. But I think it is interesting that they went for. I mean, these are really. There's 3 kind of UI patents which are interesting. I think there's a story to tell about touchscreen interface and other interface concepts there. But the 7, the bulk is these 7 very, very dry technical radio transmission patents, which I have no doubt that the technology that they relate to is important and helps make our phones better. But I mean, Apple is, Apple's case is a broadside. I think the foundation of Apple's case are these utility patents. And then, the structure of it is this aesthetic. And I think that's a great story, right? You're not only, infringing on our technical underpinnings, but now you're taking our look and feel. And that's a narrative that I think the media is going to be very interested in, that I think the judge and the jury, particularly, a jury is going to really sink into. It's the iPhone, right? And then for Samsung to come back and be like, yeah, but you took the way we transmit data is, I don't know, like from a narrative aspect, it feels a little weaker. In terms of interpreting the patents, man, I mean, I'm reading them today, and they are dry. They're hard to understand. It's taken me a while to get through them.
How much do you think that really has influenced both parties' decisions, especially Apple's, in this, in realizing that there are going to be journalists like you, Nilay, writing about this stuff? I mean, do you think that entered the lawyers' minds at all when they were drafting the complaint? And we talked about this last week with Marty Schwimmer, kind of how sometimes, well, usually always, you kind of put your strong claims first toward the beginning. And we've got all these, aesthetic issues with all this, something that the general public can understand, and by that I mean, non-wonky patent attorneys here. How much do you think it affects the overall strategy and thinking about all this stuff as to, what just the general perception of the litigation is going to be like?
Well, I think Apple's complaint was written for the press. I do. The way it's structured, I mean, it's a narrative, and the actual claims come at the very end, and they're very, they're very dry. It's claim for trade dress infringement. Apple believes Samsung has infringed its trade dress. Claim for federal trade dress infringement. Here are the registration numbers. Apple believes Samsung has infringed it. Right. Mm-hmm. The story, the narrative, is in the body. Here, look at these icons. Look at these photos. It's not built into the claims, which I think the claims are kind of hard for people to understand and the way they're structured. So they built. I mean, I think Apple's entire complaint. It's on their PR site. If you go to apple.com/PR, there's the complaint. And similarly, Samsung. I mean, they emailed the complaint to me, right? I mean, they. Obviously they know I'm going to want to pull it apart, but they're making it available through their press team. So there is a huge element of this where there's a desire to frame the debate and to set a narrative through these complaints. They want the press to understand what the claims are. It's easier for Apple because they have pictures. And, the number one piece of feedback I got on my piece, which is 8,000 words, was, I love that picture of the icons. Really made it, really made it easy to understand. And I was like, that's one claim out of 16, right? So I mean, there's a lot of that.
All of us lawyers on the show had to chuckle too. On your personal blog, the picture of the lifted photograph, the non-licensed copyrighted photograph that Apple did not have permission to include, was also fairly humorous.
I thought that was really funny. I wanted to build that out more in the piece, but I didn't want to distract. I mean, that's really minor. It's the damages on that are so low and it's so stupid, but it's funny. And I wanted to build it out more in the piece, but I didn't want to distract from the real issue, which is here's a $1 billion IP infringement lawsuit. But it's funny, and I think it's crazy that Apple's Morrison & Forster, some associate was like, oh, this is perfectly acceptable for me to go to Android Community and crop their watermark. I mean, when I was in Engadget, if I cropped an Android Community watermark, I would have gotten 5,000 angry emails from people being like, this is copyright infringement, we're going to sue you, you hate Android. And it's like, Apple is doing it. Like, do you think Android Community wants to be a part of this lawsuit and provide the more I think about it, the more ridiculous it seems.
Yeah, it's a good lesson for those lawyers who, as you pointed out, were writing for the media, that if you're going to write for the media, you have to do it like a journalist and follow all the rules.
They knew exactly what they were doing, though. I mean, it's fair use, don't you think? Gives us something to talk about. But
well, it might be fair use until you cropped out the watermarks. I'd like to go back to that the issue of whether or not they really intended it to be this story, this narrative with their complaint, and I think they did. And the reason it's important to look at, they have this enormous portfolio as well, Apple does, and they have all these very technical patents dealing with very technical hardware issues, and those have been asserted against other manufacturers, HTC and Nokia. So those are out there. This one is much different. It for the most part excludes those. I mean, like Nilay said, there are some of those in there. but it really paints this picture for you and kind of walks you down this path to explain, the look and feel of the iPhone. And, much of the detail they've put in their complaint is completely unnecessary. I mean, we all know notice pleading doesn't require any of the details they've put in there with regard to what essentially is their argument going forward. They could have just done notice pleading, said, here's the product, here's the patent, here's the cause of action, here's our prayer for relief, and they're done. They didn't do that. This is clearly kind of a different approach, and they're doing it much different. And a lot of it's because they have the story to tell, because it's a close resemblance between the two systems.
Right. So, well, I mean, there's really not much to say at this point. We have the cross claims pending. We have other claims by Samsung pending internationally, and now it just has to sort of unfold. And Nilay, you were pointing out that, it's possible that at some point these parties broker an agreement and decide, okay, you've got your patents, we've got ours, and they figure something out and go home. But, it seems like early days for that kind of a resolution. Do you have any sort of final thoughts on what we can expect next? Or, is this just going to work its way through its court system and pop back on the radar in a few months, and we'll talk about it then?
I think the next time it'll pop up, is when we get the reply, which I have to anticipate is in the next few weeks, right? So, I mean, hopefully that's when the next time it'll pop up. In terms of settling out the patent claims, the cross-license or something, I could see it. It makes sense. I mean, Apple is Samsung's biggest customer, right? At some point, they have, Apple's buying the radio components from Samsung. So these underlying utility patents on the radio stuff, it feels like they have to be able to settle those and figure that out. I think Apple's going to push the trade dress, the trademark stuff, really far. If they lose those or they back off on those, I think it's open season on their aesthetic, and I think that's the last thing I want. One question I have, which I don't know if you guys covered last week, they're claiming trademarks on these icons. And I think that is absolutely fascinating. So, the iTunes icon, I get, right? It's a brand, it's a store, it's the #1 music store around the world, the biggest brand you can possibly think of. So it makes sense. They're like, okay, your music player trademark is infringing. I see that very directly. The phone icon, the more I think about it, the more that's a really crazy gray area, right? The phone, it's part of the OS, but there's no source confusion there. I don't see it. But at the same time, it's an app, right? It's the phone app. And if you built any other type of app and gave it an icon and put it on the store, I think there would be some presumption of protection for that icon as a trademark. So what do you think the built-in system apps, what kind of protection do you think they get? I'm very curious to hear your thoughts.
Well, we had Marty on last week, and he talked a lot about the trade dress, trademark considerations, and left us with the notion that if it is a functional sort of component associated with the actual design feature, then your trade dress claim is not so strong. But if it is something that is associated with the brand and this is what people think of when they look at that image or that packaging design or what have you. Go ahead.
That's the trade dress. I get that. The icons are registered trademarks, right? They're source identifier. There's nothing functional about an icon apart from the fact that you can press it, right? So I think that's washed away. I'm curious whether you think there's a source identification to the consumer that builds. There's a likelihood of confusion when you press the music player icon on a Samsung Android device. That's like the window cleaners walking around behind me.
Look like a big LCD.
No, they're screens. This is totally nuts.
Well,
I'm being told 1 minute. So I'm wondering if you think the phone app icon is like a source identifier for consumers.
I see. So when someone sees a phone, do they think of Apple?
Right. A green phone icon. The way that when you clearly see the iTunes icon. Right. When you clearly see the iTunes icon, you think of iTunes, right? But I don't know about the phone app on the phone. That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, well,
that guy just installed 3 screens in like 4 seconds. That was incredibly impressive.
You need to bring him over here, do some work.
What do you think about that one, Evan?
Well, this is something that I didn't get around to saying last week because, Marty said everything good to be saying about it last week. But as I've thought about this, I had this on the brain for another week now, there's something that's very fundamental that bothers me about the whole trademark, trade dress claim of this lawsuit. And that is, one of these elements of the likelihood of confusion analysis that we didn't talk about last week, but I think really is dispositive in all of this. And when I think about it a certain way, I say to myself, where did we lose sight of reality here? And where did we decide to jump off into the technicalities of the individual trees here and lose sight of the forest? And it boils down to this. Trademark law, as we know and as we discussed last week, protects the consuming public against confusion. We don't want there to be a likelihood of confusion as to the source of particular goods or services. And so to the extent that there is a likelihood of confusion, the law and equity will intervene and it will stop it from happening and it will make the aggrieved party whole. Good grief. Who really goes into a Verizon store or a T-Mobile store or an AT&T store and thinks, even though the Samsung phone may look a lot like the iPhone, it's the closest thing to the iPhone that isn't an iPhone, or however you want to characterize it. Who is it that really thinks when they're buying one of these things that they're getting when they're buying a Samsung phone that they're getting an iPhone, and vice versa? This, there's just something that really nags at me with this, and it makes me feel the same sense of frustration toward trademark law as we bring up, so very often when it comes to copyright law and some of the absurdities that we see once in a while, where as trademark people being wearing hats of being concerned about trademark, we dive into the interstitial technicalities and lose sight of some of the bigger pictures. So when it comes to looking at particular things like likelihood of confusion as to the phone icon, my thoughts of that are just representational of kind of a larger disdain that has developed in my mind after thinking about this for a few days.
Well, I have a couple of responses to that, right? One, I think the phone icons are different. I think they fall into different buckets, right? And maybe that's what I'm stumbling towards is I think the iTunes icon, that's actually meaningful, right? I mean, Apple sells a ton of music through iTunes, and in a lot of consumers' minds, right, that is music. That's where you get music from. So for Samsung to use the iTunes icon for the music player, that is source confusion, right? I mean,
it's
the average consumer, right? It's the phone icons and stuff. I think that's a different bucket. I think that has to be thought of differently. As to the phones, who goes in the Verizon store and buys a Fascinate and thinks it's an iPhone? I think the answer is a surprisingly huge number of people. And this is, I mean, I wrote about it in my piece. Like, I have friends, my personal friends who are like, I went to the Verizon store. They said this was just like the iPhone. It looks like the iPhone. I bought it. And now they have a Fascinate. And, they're like, screw it. Oh, my God, this isn't an iPhone.
You're friends with people?
Yeah, I mean, I have friends. Lawyers with friends. That's what happens when you quit the profession.
It surprises me. Anyway.
Right. So I have a response to this, too, and that is that and I think Web 545 in IRC agrees with me that I think that these phone icons that they have trademarks in a world where we have lawsuits over these phones that all look and seem so much alike and can be confused, as you just said, Nilay, that the icons do become a source identifier, that you look at that green phone and you know that you're holding an iPhone because
I think that's
those distinctive icons are there.
But I mean, I don't think that's been explored. I mean, I'm very curious to hear if there's cases on that. It just seems so novel to me. And I think, Apple chose to go trademark instead of copyright, right? I think their experience in the 80s and 90s with look and feel and trying to copyright a whole OS, I think that burned them forever. And I think it's interesting that they've gone trademark with this stuff as opposed to copyright, because the natural place for those icons to be is copyright.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I think my opinion is that Apple wants to tell a story here, and I think narrative, we've been talking about a narrative, and it's a good phrase for it. They want to tell a story in the totality of all of this. So they want to show you, and they would probably actually do it in the reverse order that Nilay did it. They would look at things like the iTunes icon. And when it comes down to it, they might get away with that to some extent. Technically, they can't, because they have to go through each individual trademark and they have to justify and prove up infringement. And I think it simply might come down to the fact that they may not get infringement on the phone icon. because of the differences, not so much because people aren't confused, and then you kind of look at what the differences are, and you can see some differences between that and the messaging icon and things like that. So I think they want to tell a story. You put them side by side like this, it tells a nice story. Perhaps not starting with the most
well, that's their order. I use their order.
Up. What's that?
Yeah, that's their order. That's Apple's order. I just prettied up the claims. Yeah.
Okay, so we're talking about folks confused about the identities of phones and various things that convey or betoken identity. And another interesting thing happened this week involving Danah Boyd. Are you guys familiar with Danah Boyd? Do you know who she is?
Yes, she's great.
Yes. Yeah. She is, and I'm reading from her site right now, a researcher at Microsoft Research New England and a fellow at the Harvard Berkman Center for Internet at Society. She's a doctorate, a great speaker. I've seen her at tons of tech conferences, always speaking on very high in the atmosphere kinds of privacy and other concerns and bringing them down to a very personal level and explaining them very well. So she's a great thinker and policy person, and she is at Xaphoria on Twitter and elsewhere. This is just sort of a handle that she has wound up using throughout the years because it's been convenient. It's been a way to designate herself while still maintaining some anonymity, sort of online, and also building up her own sort of personal online brand without really intending to do that. It sort of happened by accident as you read along with her posts. And it turns out that there's a company called Xaphoria out there, and this is a story that I think happens over and over again, and we've talked about it before on TWiL, that in these social media spaces, in the world of domain names after the slash, if you will, that there's a lot of identity happening there, but yet it's not something that, you can go out and register and have ICANN protection for and UDRP arbitration about. This is all sort of left to the social media companies. So the Xaphoria company went to, I guess, Danah's Tumblr account and decided they wanted to use the name Xaphoria on Tumblr, and lo and behold, temporarily Danah was deprived of her identity on that site, and then with a lot of back and forth and the fact that she's fairly well known and very vocal, she was able to iron that out with them. But she has written a great post about the whole process called A Customer Service Nightmare, Resolving Trademark and Personal Reputation in a Limited Namespace, that gives a great history of sort of how we got to where we are now with this issue. And she gives some recommendations, some non-legal, very practical recommendations for how companies should deal with this. And she doesn't really think that trademark is the way to go. Let me, I'm going to post the link up, give that to our studio here so you guys can take a look at it too. And toss it over to Matt. What do you think about all this, and how do we deal with this issue? Are you on mute?
There, I'm sorry about that.
That's okay.
Well, I read her first article, and then I saw that throughout the process she was getting responses. And I find it interesting that I see this with other, I don't know if it's happened to me, but for instance, on the Twit network, I've seen it on the Twit network. I've seen it happen with Tom and Sarah, I think, when they've had problems relating to companies, whether those companies are really part of the social media field or not, even larger companies like AT&T, they've had some real success with being able to go out there and they'll tweet out something, some complaint about service, and sure enough, there's people out there monitoring, and buffering, or at least somehow looking at these things. And I find that interesting that they're able to. These things you're able to deal with it without necessarily calling up somebody, although you often get stuck on the phone after that. But with regard to this one, it just seemed like an odd process where there was just an automatic denial here, and then they went through, and after she complained, and she got some she got some resolution. And I think her 4 points or 5 points at the end of her article are very good to show some of the possibilities you could go through. Much like just a kind of a normal negotiation to get these things dealt with, rather than having an automatic, we think, because oftentimes you just kind of have to show, okay, I've had this name, I've developed an identity, even if it's on another issue. You know, there's things out there that can be done between these parties rather than having this immediate cutoff that the company like Tumblr goes through first before they deal with any of the issues.
Right. I'm going to read those 5 points in a second, but first I want to highlight another part of her article that just made me smile and laugh, you know, looking back on the history of things and remembering when all this was unfolding. In the early days of Web 2.0, the technology stalwarts and traditional companies rolled their eyes as the millions of consumers started using social media to babble on about their lives. The New York Times dismissed bloggers as amateur diarists, and few took the cultural practices playing out particularly seriously. And then blogs started screwing with PageRank, and companies started realizing that if bloggers talked about them, it would ripple across the web. By the time Twitter got big, companies realized that they needed to jump on the bandwagon and create a presence in these newfangled spaces. And all of a sudden, companies and individuals started competing for the precious, unique identifiers on countless services across the web. My personal favorite example of this is my former law firm. Has to be designated not by Reed Smith, which was, you know, what we all called it and everybody out in the industry calls it. But there is a fellow named Reed Smith who's very popular. He has 6,500 plus followers on Twitter. And of course, he was there first because, yeah. So he is Reed Smith and they are Reed Smith LLP. And that's just the way it is. And I don't, you know, he could have been in a Danah Boyd like situation where they came and thumped and said, we have a trademark and fork it over. So I'm sure, you know, and Nilay, you probably, your handle being Reckless, I don't know if there's a company out there with that designation.
There's a really famous record store in Chicago named Reckless Records, and I'm sure there's a very famous record store in Chicago named Reckless Records, and I'm sure they hate me, which is sad because I love them, but it's okay. I was there first. You know, at some level, isn't this like, I mean, these feel like old cases, old trademark cases in new context to me. I mean, when I was in law school, I remember, you know, we sat around reading the anti-cyber squatting provisions of like Title 15 or whatever. Like, you know, I feel like this is, you know, Danah says trademark is not the answer, but like in some level, we've had this conversation in many different ways before, right? I mean, this goes back to starting, you know, VerizonSucks.com and Verizon coming and saying, you know, there's dilution here because you're ruining our brand, and we've wound this through the courts. I mean, this just seems like, you know, these 5 points, which are really good points and a good policy, it almost feels like that should be legislated. You know what I mean? Like, not, you know, you can't. You have to start this at the top. This has to be a general framework for understanding identity in society, not, well, Tumblr is a good company because they have this framework, but Twitter has a different framework. Or, you know, she goes into Facebook doling out the page names in a two-tier system. You know, there's a balance there. I mean, I think it, you know, when I was in Engadget, there was a lot of people who would squat the Engadget name on different services, and we would have to go and, you know, write the emails and say, well, we need the Engadget name back because, you know, this guy's posting pictures of himself naked, and we can't have that. So, I mean, that, you know, there's a certain amount of, I see both sides of this issue very clearly, but I feel like the real solution, you know, I don't know when I became this sort of like statist person. The real solution, I think, comes from above the individual service and corporate level. I think it has to come at a legislative level, and that's why, you know, there's a relationship to trademarks here where we've solved a lot of these problems in trademark, and there's a relationship there that I think needs to be developed further.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, because if you look at these 5 points, a lot of the criteria and the analysis.
Let's say what they are. We've been talking a lot about them. Let's. Number one is, you know, unlike what happened to Danah, I don't think she was ever contacted. I think she was just locked out of her account. So she suggests that you try to contact the account holder whose account is being challenged via email, private message, etc., and give them time to respond. Before moving or deleting the account, post a message on the account indicating that the ownership has been challenged and asking the viewers of the page to ask the owner to contact the service as soon as possible to resolve it. This will prompt the user's friends to get them to act, and then explicitly ask both parties for comments, perhaps even consider asking the broader user base to weigh in. Treat the identity space as a commons because that's what it is. Number 4, deal with each case on an individual basis, weighing first come trademark, personal reputation, web presence history, activity on the service, etc. Don't simply reinforce existing power by assuming that the company is more legitimate than the individual. And finally, publicly explain the decision-making process so that the public understands the issues. Think of this as a court record. Because, she says, it kills me when social media companies scream about the importance of open source and governmental transparency, but refuse to make their own customer service processes transparent. So,
okay,
Evan,
I've got to jump in here. I've really got to jump in here and ask the question. I mean, are you kidding, Danah? I mean, yes, these are all wonderful, lofty ideals, but good grief. This is totally going to multiply the amount that it costs to use Tumblr, right? How much is the sign-up fee for Tumblr? How much is it? Nothing. Yeah. Who's going to pay for this? I mean, this 5-part process of, which is essentially due process and all of that stuff. I mean, this is a wonderful theoretical abstract idea, but to think that this should become the norm for platform providers like this is just simply asking too much. There's got to be a better way around this, and I don't know what that is, but I think I know at least what direction it points. Or what direction we need to point to get there. And that direction is the place out there somewhere where there is no longer a distinction, which I believe is an artificial distinction that Danah is making here, between trademark law and these norms that seem to arise in the social media context. And there are a couple of places in the article where she brings up this idea. First, she says individuals have become corporatized just as corporations have become people. So we see kind of this reversing of roles as to how identity plays out for a particular entity, whether it be a person or a company. Then she says later on, a company may have a trademark. She's talking about these companies who have trademark rights, but then just kind of go out and use monikers, sign up for accounts using certain names without really doing anything meaningful there. She says they may have a trademark, but in social media land, they're squatters. And then finally, she says, when she's talking about some of these norms or some of these, these 5 points things here, she's saying these are not simply to protect trademark owners, but to balance the interests of all relevant parties. So all 3 of these observations that I've pulled out of these things are implicitly talking about a distinction, or maybe a better way of thinking about it is, there's a universe of identity here. And for those of you just listening and not watching, I'm drawing a big circle on the screen as if to represent the universe in a Venn diagram. That is identity, and within that is just trademark. There's perhaps one of the things we could do is kind of expand that scope of what trademark is. And I realize this is dangerous to be saying this, but we need to somehow reduce the lack of overlap between all of these rights and what they are, and somehow figure out a normative way that these things are protected in ways that will, if we're going to have a top-down solution, which you suggest, Nilay, which is probably the only practical way to get this done if we can't rely on market forces for a free service like Tumblr to do it, it's got to be in a language or in a set of regulations with the small r that makes sense and kind of encapsulate cognitively what these interests truly are without this artificial distinction.
Well, I think it's interesting when you say market forces there, because it's, the only way I think the market works in this context is if you had a site exactly like Tumblr that offered a different set of policies about domain or usernames, right? And then people could choose the market solution that worked better. But that's never going to happen. There's a limit to how much the market can operate. And I don't think anybody looks at these policies to make a decision about what product to purchase or what service to use. So it has to come from the top down, because I don't think the market will ever act on this stuff. I don't think anybody is going to leave Facebook because they change the way they dole out page names. I think they'll get irritated and say, well, you should change this. And Facebook will say, okay, maybe we'll change it. But there's no market for other types of policies in this place. there are some places, and it's weird. It's weird for me. It feels cognitively wrong for me to think the government should do something. It instinctively feels like the wrong answer to me. But I think in a case like this, I think you're right. You have to say, well, we have a body of law that deals specifically with like brand, right? Mm-hmm. And what people associate with brand. And we have to, right, source. And we have to, somehow nudge that in a direction that we can deal with these new forms of source identification and personal brand and all this stuff. And I think it can be done. And I think it can be done in a narrow way that doesn't implicate all kinds of other crazy stuff. But I agree that I think there's trademark here in a real way, and it's not set aside trademark and think about holistically all this. That's a whole other. It's like creating another body of law, and I don't think we want to do that.
It's norms, and I always get really nervous when we rely too much on norms. Clearly, the great example that Larry Lessig used when he spoke here in Chicago the other day about the importance of norms. You don't wear a man is not going to wear a dress to give a keynote presentation at a play. Or was that Larry Lessig who said that? Anyway, that's a great example of a norm. I don't think it was him, but I read that somewhere else. Norms are important, but if we're going to rely on them to have as much of an effect as we want them to have, or as much as law has, and if we're going to delegate that responsibility to norms and have faith that they will be executed in that way, that's really dangerous. And I see something akin to what de Tocqueville talked about in the tyranny of the majority, because things can get really out of hand when you rely on norms like this. It's got to be more systematized in some way.
Well, I mean, one thing that occurs to me, and I don't necessarily think it would work very well, but it seems like a logical thing to think about in this context is bolting something on to the domain name system that deals with this, because we are talking about domain names. We're simply talking about the subdomain portion of them that comes after the slash. So, I mean, we do have arbitration and various rules and norms set up around how you resolve when two people want the same domain name. So perhaps there's some sort of systematized way we could address this problem. Yeah, but are you going to put
Reed Smith the guy? Are you going to put Reed Smith the guy in ICANN arbitration against Reed Smith LLP? I mean, that is so out of balance. Yeah, I mean, that's so out of balance. I mean, whatever. I mean, are you going to put, Mercedes, the girl across the street, in ICANN arbitration against Mercedes-Benz? I mean,
right. Well, I guess that's Dana's point too, is that we've wound up individuals have wound up playing in this world that is very corporatized. The norms and rules that deal with these things, and they are not equipped to combat at the level that would be necessary. What do you think, Matt? Any insights here for us?
No, I've been sitting here trying to think about the legislative side, and I can't fathom what that's going to look like. So I'm having a hard time picturing. Obviously, I would always prefer to let the market work it out. But I think Nilay is right that these aren't issues that companies care about enough. And I suppose one market pressure that comes up is something like this, where it gets press, and maybe Tumblr changes their policy in some way, but that's unlikely for companies like Facebook, no matter how many complaints they get, until it gets to that big, exploding issue that they have to deal with in the press. So I honestly, I don't know. It'd be nice just to see these sort of things implemented, at least to some extent. I know the cost, and that's a good argument by Evan with regard to the cost, but I think there's some level of this that can be done with these companies where your individual identification on the web is so important.
Right. Well, we have a bunch more important and interesting stories, including the iOS tracking kerfuffle, to talk about after our break here. But first, I want to take a moment to thank our sponsor for the show, Netflix. Episode 109 of TWiL here is brought to you by Netflix, which delivers movies directly to your home and saves you time, money, and hassle. One of my favorite parts of what Netflix has been up to these days is that you can watch instantly thousands of TV episodes and movies streamed directly to your PC or Mac or iPad or other handheld device that runs a Netflix app. Or you can stream it directly to your TV via a Netflix-ready device, including Xbox 360, PS3, Nintendo Wii, Roku. All sorts of DVD players have the Netflix app on them these days. Of course, you can always get your DVDs by mail, too, which is a great aspect of the service. It's what it was founded on, and it's always good to get the DVDs and be able to send them back as well. So you can watch as many movies as you want, anytime you want. There are never any late fees or due dates, which is just a joy. And we have a pick of the week for you from Netflix, courtesy of my own household here. My son is discovering the joys of Batman, playing a lot of the Batman Lego kinds of things on his Xbox and with friends. So we wanted to expose him to the wonderful, quirky Adam West Batman series, which he had never seen. And one thing I did not know, but you can watch instantly on Netflix, is that there is a movie called Batman the Movie that is based on that wonderful campy series. I couldn't find any of the episodes readily available on Netflix or elsewhere, but the movie is, it very much encapsulates them. It has the same cast. It's directed by Leslie H. Martinson and stars Adam West and Burt Ward. They battle sharks, Catwoman, who of course was Lee Merriweather, the Joker, Cesar Romero, the Penguin, Burgess Meredith, and the Riddler, Frank Gorshin. So it's just, you know, a great snapshot of what that whole series was about, complete with the pows and bams and whams from all the action shots. So Batman the Movie is our Netflix peak for this week. You can instantly watch it or choose from thousands of TV episodes and other movies when you register for a free trial membership. Go to netflix.com/twit and you can sign up for your free trial. We thank Netflix so much for their support of This Week in Law. Are you guys big Batman fans when you were growing up?
Oh, yeah. That movie is awesome, by the way. I love that movie.
I hadn't seen it until yesterday. And,
yeah, it is ridiculous and amazing.
Yes, it was good. And I love Frank Gorshin. He always reminds me, too, of that great Star Trek episode where he played one of the guys with the half black, half white face. Let That Be Your Last Battlefield, I think it was called. Their wonderful race commentary. So as we're racing through our stories here, let's talk about iOS tracking and Android tracking and cell phone tracking in general, and whether this is a big deal or not. Certainly it's been getting a lot of press. It's from, I think, Apple's and I think probably the other handheld device manufacturers' standpoints. This is something that, you know, they've disclosed and that is offering all kinds of good functionality for their users. And yet it has caused a grave concern and now a lawsuit over whether it's been adequately disclosed and how it's being used. So, Nilay, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's actually two bits of news today that are related to this. One, Apple and Google, May 10th, going to the Senate for a hearing on location tracking. So I think there'll be a lot of activity around that. And then two, Verizon today announced that they had previously decided to do it, and they're doing it as of now, putting a sticker on every phone that can track you that says, this phone can track you and here are all the ways. Consult your user manual, turn it off. So
let me count the way.
Some movement in the world. Yeah. So there's some movement. You know, I think with Apple, you know, they posted this Q&A about what they're doing and exactly how. You know, I'm not sure that it's very carefully worded, that Q&A. I'll put it that way. You know, they very bluntly say, we're not tracking you. We never have. We never will. And then they go on to explain how they have a cache of hotspot data, cell tower data that they use to quickly determine location and all this stuff. What they leave out, I think, is the fact that every time you do a location thing on an iPhone, anytime you hit location services, it timestamps the Wi-Fi tower, the Wi-Fi hotspots, the cell towers around you, and says, at this timestamp, you know, we ping these things. And that's what makes it tracking, right? There is an action that the phone takes, and that action results in the ability for somebody to use the data to track you. So I think Apple's being very careful when they say, we're not tracking you, because it's obviously not their intent, right? They, you know, to maintain a cache of data, you have to know how old the data is to know if it's any good or not, because you're not updating it constantly. So there's a reason they're timestamping it, which, you know, that's an assumption that seems valid, but the end result of all these mistakes they've made, keeping too much data, you know, backing up to your computer, the end result of it is that they're tracking you. And so when they say we're not tracking you, I think they're speaking to intent. And there's intent and there's consequence. And, I think the steps they've outlined they're going to take, where they're going to cut the amount of data down to just a week, they're not going to back it up to your computer, and then in iOS 5, presumably, they're going to encrypt the data, then I think all this stuff vanishes and it's not a problem. But the narrow, right now, the phone's tracking you. And I think that they're sort of like, that's the elephant in the room, that they're dancing around with statements about how they have no intention to track you.
Nilay, you have probably you and Denise both have, you have something that I don't come into contact with, and that's like a lot of feedback on these issues. And my first instinct when I heard about this was, okay, I get it, but is this going to be like antenna gauge or the sheared glass on the iPhone? Do people really care? I mean,
no,
it's one of those things. It's like, I mean, do they really care, or is this going to go away in 2 weeks?
I think some people care a lot. I think my readers don't seem to care. They're used to being tracked. I mean, they're all Google users, right? I mean, they're all Gmail users, and I think that the more sophisticated you are, the more comfortable you are with the idea that you have a lot of devices in your life that know everything about you, right? If somebody got a hold of my laptop, they would know almost everything about me. I mean, they would be able to location track me just by looking at my email, because I'm constantly telling people where I'm going. Right. Once you invite all these sophisticated devices in your life and learn about how they work, I think you become comfortable with the idea that they know a lot about you, and if somebody got a hold of them, they would also know a lot about you. I think that is a tiny, self-selecting minority. It's a vocal minority, but it's still a minority. I think a lot of people, and I don't know why I keep on sounding like the government should do everything for everybody, but here I am again. A lot of people, they don't know it, right? And there is a place for there to be a set of consequences for going too far for every product and service, because the consumer, there isn't a market, again, for this to be fixed, right? I mean, Apple does it, Google does it, Microsoft does it. There isn't a phone that doesn't track you that provides all the services that these phones do. So, there comes a time when I think there is a legislative solution here, a regulatory solution to say, this is the amount of tracking you're going to do. And it's because I think the vast majority of consumers are not sophisticated enough to understand it. So the protection has to come from the people who do understand it, which again makes me sound like this crazy statist. It's bothering me that I keep on coming up with these solutions, but there it is. Support your government, ladies.
You've been hanging out at the University of Chicago, so it's okay.
But they're like the most anti-regulatory school in the world.
Yeah, that's the point I'm trying to make. Maybe you're just resistant to that. You've been pushed into this ethereal kind of like, let's take care of everybody. It's here we are. It's a nanny.
I just want to give the world a hug. Yeah, I don't know. It's bothersome to me, but here I am constantly.
Yeah, well, here are a couple of consumers who have taken things into their own hands in Florida, where they filed suit against Apple. Vikram Ajampur and William DeVito, both of whom own Apple products, are the plaintiffs. And interestingly, they're suing not just under privacy laws, violations of privacy are alleged, but also under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which, if I can explain that very lengthy bit of legislation in very straightforward terms, essentially says, thou shalt not mess with my device. Am I right on that, Evan?
Well,
pretty much sum it up.
That's actually pretty good, and you just at least got to explain it enough to be able to make it clear that the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act claim is a total loser in this type of situation, at least on what we have right now. And if I'm going to say something dramatic like that, I'll follow it up with why I believe that.
Please do.
The Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is the federal anti-hacking statute. There's a civil cause of action for it for unauthorized access to a protected computer that results in loss or damage to the to the person affected. It doesn't necessarily have to be your computer that's unlawfully or accessed without authorization, but that's usually how it plays out. So the theory of the case is that the unlawful action, there was really two kinds of it here. One was in collecting this data. The other one was in transmitting it. I guess from it's unclear because
but there's no transmission.
But they do talk about transmission. I think what he was talking about is the transmission to the device that you're backing it up on. That's all I could gather from it. It's very, very unclear.
Transmission to your own device.
Right, and that theory has been a loser before, but that's not why I think this is this claim is going to fail. It's much more subtle, and it's much more relevant to the larger issue of what the heck do we do when somebody is the victim of some kind of breach, some kind of security breach or information loss out of some vector, whether it's that vector is your the manufacturer of your cell phone and the provider of the software for it, or whether it's a hacker or whatever else. And this point that I'm trying to make here is that I don't think that there is yet the point in time where users have suffered loss or damages as defined by the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Both of those terms are defined here, and the term damage means you mess up the computer. You impair the integrity of the system or the data that's on it. I don't know that that's been shown here. It doesn't seem like it's been pleaded here. Loss means, what it actually costs you because of that. You lose connectivity, you lose, you have to spend money to figure out what on earth has gone wrong here, doing a security analysis or something like that. The only place I could see in the complaint that was filed here where they talk about loss or damage is, paragraph 15 talks about this risk of privacy violations and stalking. Now, they actually use the word stalking. There could be stalking that goes on here. And section 16 just says that they're harmed by the accrual, the collection of this information. Both of those are just very speculative, forward-looking notions about what actually has gone wrong here, how these users have been harmed. And there is some other authority, specifically here from the Seventh Circuit, a case from 2007. I forget the name of the case, but I think it involved a bank. Somebody sued their bank because there was a security breach and said, "Bank, you should pay for my credit monitoring services." And the bank said, "No, we don't think we should have to do that." And the judges agreed, saying, "You haven't shown that there's actual loss here that should entitle you to compensation." The court essentially, not under the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, but under a different theory, said, you really haven't suffered harm here because it's all prospective. There's no reason for us to have to order, your credit monitoring services to be paid for because ain't nothing happened yet. Same thing is here. Just the mere fact that this data has been collected and it didn't crash the devices or anything because of this, so there's no damage. That's why I think the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act claim is dead in the water on this. But hope I'm wrong. It would make some good television, right?
Absolutely.
Do you guys know about taco suits? Have I said this on the show yet? So I have this every time anything happens in the technology world, I get a pile of press releases from little class action firms who all file around the country, which is great. I mean, that's the system. It's good. They should do it. But they all send me press releases, and a lot of them are specious. They're like this. I don't think anything is going to come of this. I don't know what the harm to the consumer was. It's like, this has been happening for months. Apple's like, we made a mistake. We'll turn it off. Nothing.
Why do you call them taco suits?
So anyway, the best press release I ever got was when that firm sued Taco Bell for having like 88% meat. And Taco Bell was like, yeah, because there's other stuff in the meat. Like, this makes sense. So I've been, sawdust. And whatever makes it delicious. If I could just get a bottle of that. Anyway, so I started calling all specious class actions taco suits. And I think this one is a true taco suit against location tracking, because there's no harm to anybody yet. I mean, actually, I will say this. There is one prospective harm. I read a few articles that they talked to forensics researchers and law enforcement, and they said, we use this data on the phones, this location data, and we've gotten convictions based on it. And so Apple's saying, we don't track you. This data isn't your location. It's not tracking information. I mean, there are potentially like felons behind bars who need to have their convictions overturned because the manufacturer of the device is saying this isn't actually the location data that the conviction was based on. So who knows? That could be wild. But this particular suit, I think, is much more narrow. It's a class action, right? I mean, I think convicted felons, I think, don't belong to that class.
Right.
It's odd to start a class action like this without any real insight or forethought on the actual damages, because, I mean, that's really what class action suits are about. I was going to ask a question. I'm not familiar with these particular claims. Whether or not is there any statutory damages that go along with any of these?
I think the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act has statutory damages provision. I want to say, I don't quote me on that. And so actually I won't say anything you can quote me on, but I believe it does. And maybe punitive damages.
Because there's no actual damages that they're going to get on the monetary side. So it seems to me as if there's a statutory damages, it can be, times 10,000 for each person in the class action. Maybe they got something. But I think what's going to happen is the main remedy is to fix it. And by the time that this gets to a point that is heard, this case, it's going to be moot if Apple's implemented these procedures they're going to put into place in the next few weeks.
Right. One hopes.
Yeah.
Right.
All right. So as long as we're talking about class actions, I do want to check in with the High Court of our land, the Supreme Court of the United States, which issued a big decision this week called AT&T Mobility versus Conception, or Concepcion, if I'm saying that properly. And it had to do with the underlying case, which has wound its way up through the appellate courts to the Supreme Court, had to do with a couple that had been charged sales tax on mobile phones that AT&T had advertised as free. The couple believed their charges were unfair and constituted false advertising and fraud. So that was the nature of their claims. But now we've talked a lot on TWiL about fine print buried in contracts that may bind you both on the web and off the web. And there was an arbitration provision in this contract, as there are in many, many contracts with big corporations. And here we are back to our situation where the individual is pitted against the resources of large corporations. Well, in this instance, you had the lower courts deciding that that part of the agreement with AT&T was unconscionable and not enforcing it and not forcing these consumers into arbitration on their class action that they brought. And you had the Supreme Court unwinding all of that and saying, no, indeed, we have a federal arbitration act in this country that advances policies that we think are valuable, and that, the arbitration process helps people, companies and individuals save money and streamlines the litigation process. So we want to promote arbitration, and we're going to go ahead and enforce this clause in this contract. And the end result here is that companies, AT&T and others, can force these class action suits, taco suits or otherwise, into arbitration rather than having them go through the main court system and be heard by a jury, which tends to be more beneficial for consumers in these kinds of cases. So, Nilay, did you take a look at this, and do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, on some level, it's just a statutory interpretation case, right? I mean, it's a preemption case. It's and then on the other level, it's a it's a consumers versus corporate case. And I think that our current makeup of the Supreme Court, I mean, I think Scalia had to have been up at night, pacing the halls, deciding whether he wants to be a federalist or pro-business. Those two aspects of his makeup, I think, are at odds with each other. And
we should mention this was a very close ruling, a 5-4 ruling from the Supreme Court. So one justice
like down the line 5-4, right? I mean, no surprises here. I could, if Scalia had come back if 5-4, they said, well, the states trumped that would make sense. I mean, but the solution here, this isn't the end of the line. The solution here is to have the Federal Arbitration Act revised. And again, that's still an opportunity. And I think consumer groups should be mobilizing to go do that right now. I mean, that's the real solution to this case, because then the Supreme Court can't say this wasn't the intent. I mean, if you look at it as a narrow federal preemption argument, then this case makes sense. But it still sucks. I mean, taco suits or not, I mean, that is the process. And every time literally anything happens, like there's any little bit of news about some company doing something, like, connects are failing, I get a press release about a class action. And so there is a certain amount of noise in the system, right? But that's the whole point of the system. So, I think that the end result of this is that the Federal Arbitration Act should be revised to allow for this. But at the same time, I see exactly why this case was decided this way. It just makes me unhappy that it got to this point.
Right. Evan, how about we've talked a lot on the show about unconscionable things that get inserted into agreements that people haven't read. What do you think about this case from that standpoint?
That it's hard for us to get our minds, as consumers around this idea that you may be bound by something that you didn't read and it was in a long contract and something like that. But I just don't know a good way around the general setting or the general rule that you are bound by the terms of a contract unless it's found to be both procedurally and substantively unconscionable. And when you're buying a cell phone, no one has a gun to your head. Nobody is, trying to make you do something you don't want to do. You're under your own free will when you go in there. And if you aren't under your own free will, then it might be procedurally unconscionable and it's not going to be binding. But for those 99.9, on purchases of cell phones, it's your decision to not read those things. And given the interest of the company here, and I don't want to sound gloaty or grandiosely pro-corporate and all of this, but given the interest of the companies here in managing the costs of litigation, the restricting the scope of these things so that it all has to be an arbitration is good for the corporate interest. And, if one wants to take a Reaganomics perspective on it as well, that's good for us as consumers because it's going to keep the prices of these goods and these services down. So I'm all about letting the mechanics of these contracts do what it is that the drafters of them intend to do. I don't want to see people being taken advantage of, but I think that if something is unconscionable and it rises to the level of the analysis that the law still provides, which in this case does not overturn, the fact if something is procedurally or substantively unconscionable, it won't be enforced. That's how we ought to do it. We ought to stick to the mechanics and not try to make up ad hoc rules, which is what I think the Supreme Court was suggesting that the Ninth Circuit had done.
Can I throw a monkey wrench into that? What happens if the AT&T T-Mobile merger goes through, right? And then we do have a sort of an actual duopoly of wireless providers in this country, right? With some regional options, but mostly a duopoly. And then if you do want a cell phone, you kind of do have a gun to your head that you have to go to these two big providers that have the same language in the contracts. I mean, this comes back to the market argument, right? I mean, maybe Leap Wireless has a different contract, but they don't have nationwide service for the phone you want or what have you. Does that change your calculus if there is a duopoly?
Well, it brings it in. It brings the calculus into a realm that uses different terms. You're not. I understand, clearly that you're using a metaphor, talking about a gun to your head, and that metaphor is, or that gun to your head metaphorically is the lack of choice. And, given the fact that we live in a society where you just got to have these mobile devices to be a member of it and participate in a democracy and all that stuff, you do have no real reasonable alternative to that. So, again, I don't know that it's going to change the calculus ultimately, because these are functions of contract law. And at the same time, we're not talking about the doing away with of a remedy. We're not, what this case does not say, and no one has suggested, and I hope that, we as intelligent people are not making the assumption that what this means is this Justice Scalia has told us that if you get screwed over by your cell phone company, you can't do anything about it. That's absolutely not what this is saying. What we say here is just the mechanism, the avenue for you to seek that remedy is different now. You got to go through the arbitration that you're agreeing to, not join in with other folks in a class action lawsuit. Now, I will acknowledge that the absence of a class action lawsuit, the inability to do that, if your claim is only for 12 cents, you're not going to file a lawsuit or even go to arbitration over 12 cents, sales tax or whatever. That is, for all intents and purposes, the taking away of a remedy. But I think that, if the antitrust framework can stay into play here and make sure that there we're not really to that point where the metaphor rings true, that there is a gun to your head, and that, we still maintain on the other kind of side of the triangle here, the unconscionability analysis. Hopefully there's some kind of balance to where this law as a complex adaptive system, it's a motif I've brought up before, it'll all kind of just stay in check. Hopefully. That's the ideal.
Yeah, can I?
Yeah, I definitely see that.
I think
Go
there's
ahead,
two
Matt.
things. There's two things that come up here that trouble people. That if I look at it that way, it doesn't trouble me as much. And the first thing is, what people aren't reading these, and that's just unfortunate. But it's a loser argument. I mean, it's you have to deal with these multi-page contracts, these EULAs, terms of service. It's a common thing, and it hasn't been dealt with yet to the point where they've determined what it is they have to do to, so it's not unconscionable. It's assumed to be a valid agreement. They haven't required them to put summaries in or some sort of outline that would break it down more detail or more broadly so that they could understand the terms. And then the other part of this is really what the terms of it are. And here, I think it's almost always going to be okay. And I think that's the part of this ruling that makes sense to me is to have somebody basically opt in, whether they know it or not. They're opting into this idea of reducing costs and making it simple potentially for both parties to resolve a dispute. Now, when they're going to get into the unconscionable portion of it is when the terms of it are, okay, you have to go to arbitration. Oh, and the max damages you can get is $1.75. I mean, if you start doing that in the contract, then maybe it does become unconscionable. And I go back to law school, and there was this one case, and it was a big case, and it dealt with this issue where you had airlines that had tickets, and on their tickets they would have some sort of disclaimer that no one could see or read, no one ever knew was there. That said basically you could get like $75 for every death from a plane crash. The max you could reach, it was crazy like that, and I don't remember what. To me, that seems unconscionable. It doesn't rise to that level.
What if you've been tricked into buying the wrong phone because of the confusingly similar icons that are displayed?
Well, that's just clearly unconscionable.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I want to get into what's going on with Righthaven and the bed intruder. But before we do that, I want to thank our second sponsor for episode 109 of This Week in Law, and that is Trim Tonic. I don't know if you guys remember or have seen on the TWiT network before, Brain Tonic, which is one of my favorite beverages. The folks who bring you Brain Tonic have brought you now Trim Tonic. It's a natural appetite suppressant tonic that takes the edge off being hungry. What makes Trim Tonic unique is that we use no stimulants to get this effect. No caffeine, no hoodia. Instead, they use active ingredients, some of which have clinical studies showing their ability to curb appetite and reduce body fat. The three main ingredients are Acaranthus aspera and Ervingia gabonensis seed extracts, which are both tropical plants used in India and Africa for curbing appetites. The third is cocoa leaf extract. So visit trimtonic.com for more information and our coupon code TWIT for a 20% discount. And we thank them so much for their support of This Week in Law. So, Evan, why don't you give us an update? I have decided that this qualifies as internet law. What's going on with the bed intruder?
Oh, poor Antoine Dodson. If you remember, there was this video. I was going to remember the guys who put it together, but his sister was the victim of an attempted assault in a home invasion in their home. They're down in, I think, Huntsville, Alabama. And so Antoine was interviewed by the news, and just a real charismatic guy, said some really, energized things over, during his news interview to the perpetrator of this. And it was very animated. And so some remix artists took this and ran the audio through auto-tune and timed the video sequence to make a really neat little video about how they snatching your people up and all of that stuff. So that was, really popular, and the song has become popular on iTunes. Just look for the Bed Intruder song, and that's that. So the point of all this, there was a news story involving Antoine this past week where he had to show up in court on some drug charges. And the point of this is kind of an exhibition of the phenomenon of micro celebrity. This guy has been thrust into the spotlight, and I don't know if we ever talked about this. I don't think we ever talked about this on the show before, but it's interesting to think of some of the rights that were at issue when this was first made, because the artists took this video, this news segment off of the they got a copy of it and did their artistry on it, and I was wondering what kind of clearance they had gotten, copyright and rights of publicity and all that stuff by using it in this way. But clearly they brought Mr. Dodson on board, because he came along with this, and I'm sure he's getting paid royalties, and he's performed at a BET event and everything else. So he has embraced, this appropriation of his likeness and his voice and all that stuff. But here he is. The CNN article, it's in our show notes today, talks about how the 20-year-old has been catapulted to fame and all of that stuff. And so he's internet famous and all of that stuff. And so here it is. The poor kid gets busted for, for pot. And
it was yes, weed, that thing that grows like grass, as he said.
That's right. And
exactly.
So here he is. We're talking about him on TWiL. All because of what the internet can do for a person's notoriety. We'll say it that way.
Go ahead.
I want to quote the best part of this entire article is the last part. He says, "I got pulled over in my Benz Mercedes E-Class."
That's right.
Very, very specific.
Yes, that's important. I wonder if he had that before the song.
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
I wonder if his Twitter handle is Mercedes E-Class.
Yeah.
Yes.
We're really tying it all together today. This is going well. I like it.
Yes. The other interesting thing we're tracking this week, no pun intended, is what's going on with Right Haven. And nothing good is going on with Right Haven. I mean, really not too much good has been going on with them since their inception, but things are really not going their way. They've had their hat handed to them in several lawsuits now, the most recent of which was this week. And also, Evan, you caught that their site was down for a bit, which is sort of ironic given that they've been demanding that other people's sites be taken down because of the copyright violations they are alleging. You want to bring us up to speed on that one?
Yeah, like you say, poor Right Haven. It's just not been, things have not been going well for them this week. And I just happened to catch this. This was only really, happening for a few hours over the weekend. And when I sent an email, as soon as I saw this, I sent an email to you, and I can't remember if I copied Eric Gardner on it or if I just sent it to him immediately after, because he, of course, got sued a few weeks ago by Right Haven, and it was dismissed and all that stuff. But GoDaddy, being a domain name registrar, has an obligation to maintain the integrity of its whois information for all domain name registrants, and it reserves the rights. It's actually obligated by ICANN to make sure it reserves this right to disable account access and disable web content located at a particular domain name if the registrant doesn't provide accurate whois information to the registrar. And so GoDaddy took the liberty under this reservation of rights to disable Right Haven's account after I think it got tipped off by someone that the whois information for the righthaven.com domain name was not accurate. So we all can have a little chuckle out of this, which is something that it happens, but it would not rise to the level of being worthy of talking about here if it wasn't for Right Haven, who is taking this holier than thou position when it comes to copyright ownership, and to make that transgression even worse, asking for all of these remedies that it's not entitled to, namely, judge, tell them to stop infringing copyright, but also give me their domain name and their web servers and all that stuff. It really makes it nice and humorous and comical that this little thing happened to Right Haven over the weekend. So
yeah, and why do I think the GoDaddy got a little bit of pleasure out of that?
I think they might have, because anytime anybody's going to be messing with kind of the status quo of domain name ownership, like what Right Haven's doing, asking for it to be transferred when they're not entitled to it, could be a headache on the part of the domain name registrar.
Definitely. And if for anybody is interested in a recap of the legal headaches that Right Haven has been undergoing lately, if you go to TechDirt, Mike Masnick's blog, TechDirt, under the category company name Right Haven, and we've got all this in our discussion points at delicious.com/thisweekinlaw/109. There is just, suit after suit, instance after instance of when Right Haven's doings in court are not going their way. So,
speaking of Delicious, did you see that it got sold this past week? Did you catch that?
I did indeed see, and by July, I need to do something with the Delicious account that we use for This Week in Law. For the time being, I've decided to ignore it. But they make you transfer it over to the new service, and the new company is called Avos, I think, AVOS. Chad Hurley and I believe another YouTube founder have come in and scooped up Delicious. So that's probably good news. But remains to be seen. Nilay, any Right Haven thoughts before we move on to other things?
I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah, there's not a lot to say. I mean, this company has been ridiculous for a long time, and there's a certain amount of karma here that I think is pleasing to all of us.
Yes, exactly. Also pleasing is the notion that you might have a seat and make a tweet. Evan also sent me this link to a seat that when you sit down begins to chronicle the fact that you're there. You want to tell us more about this one, Evan?
Yes, this was a post over on the Tech Cocktail blog put up by my buddy Frank Gruber, and I think this is actually, I don't know where it is. Is it in the UK? I don't know exactly.
I think so. Yeah, let me pull it up real quick.
Where it's a park bench, and it has some means by which it is made aware of when somebody sits on it, and then it snaps. Or I guess there are two different pictures, two different cameras that are positioned to take a picture of the person who is sitting on the bench, and then also the surroundings, and then those are posted to the web using Twitter, and the photo is put up through TwitPic. So this is a really interesting idea, because it brings in some cool notions, some cool community sociality things, whatever, insert the appropriate social media buzzword here. But naturally it when we look at it from this kind of perspective, it brings in some interesting privacy implications, because it would not be difficult at all for an unsuspecting person to sit down on this seat, even though it is adorned with the very familiar source identifying little blue bird that tells us all Twitter, right?
Right. Well, as we know, Paul Siglia has never heard of Facebook, so it's entirely possible that someone might not have heard of Twitter.
Right. And I went to the T-Mobile store looking for an iPhone, but that's neither here nor there. So the unsuspecting person who sits there is going to have their picture, their mug, put out there on TwitPic, and maybe not even know it. And so this is a exactly a Kashmir Hill kind of privacy issue of, what kind of expectation of privacy, or what kind of expectation we're going to have as to where our image is going to be sent out, when we're in a public space like this. So really an intriguing little project that, asks, just by its very existence, some interesting and provocative little privacy questions. And I think it's interesting to see it playing out in the TwitPic ecosystem like this.
Yes, Sandy McKeon over on our Facebook page at facebook.com/thisweekinlaw says this is kind of creepy, especially when paired with the iPhone's unstoppable tracking. Big Brother is watching you. So
yeah, well, my Frank Gruber, who wrote the post that drew my attention to this over on the techcocktail.com, he suggested taking it a step further and trying to tie in Gowalla and Foursquare. So that, I guess, the theory, those are location-based things. So my thought was, what's the big appeal for there being a location-based data point for something that's always in the same spot? But I see what he's talking about. It would be tying the identities of people who are going everywhere else and seeing the tweeting seat as one spot in the whole, what's the word I'm looking for? Gestalt of places that people are going to. So, there are even more, depending on how you look at it, more innovative and or invasive ways of implementing something like this.
Right. Eli, do you think there will be a taco suit over the tweeting seat that they have not sufficiently disclosed that when you sit down there?
Wait, so is this in the UK? Is that clear?
It doesn't say it. It's made by a UK company.
Yes.
Because in the UK, there's a whole different set of here we go, thematic unity. There's a whole different set of norms around surveillance and particularly cameras, right? And I think there's some ridiculous number of times that every person in the UK is photographed every day, right? It's like thousands of times. So from that perspective, it's like, I'm sure that the citizens of the UK are much more apt to not care about having the picture taken. I think the flip side for this, for me, is how is this different than any other live stream camera that you might set up in a park or in a public place? I mean, what is a reasonable expectation of privacy in a park on a bench with a huge blue sign that says tweeting seat? I mean, I don't think you have one there. I don't know that it implicates any of that.
James Grimmelman would have some interesting things to say about this. He's a professor. I'm sure you've run across his work at New York University Law School, and he wrote a really interesting article in the second half of 2010 that talked about identities like this as first-class objects. And so the difference between this and just a webcam on a park or something like that is that you are tied to a particular thing, and you have an electronic identity, which would be, well, it's not your electronic identity, but it is a particular cell in the database associated with this tweeting seat account or wherever it all resides in on the TwitPic system, so that a person's identity and their location and their timing and all that stuff is much more ascertainable than just this diffuse picture of a park. There's something much more ascertainable about who, when, and why, I guess. No, that's much more speculative. But who, at least, and when, who is there and when they're there. As to why, that's we'll leave that to Kierkegaard or something.
So you're saying it's basically like there's a permalink to you were here, right? As opposed to you have a video stream and you can say 5 minutes past the hour this person walked by, which is a little bit more ethereal. But
yes,
is that right? That's the whole? I mean, is that enough to pin an argument on that there's a violation of privacy here? That there's a permalink to your record as opposed to some discrete time that you can be seen?
Yeah, goodness. Yeah, who knows?
I suppose know if you actually made an informed decision to sit there knowing what was going to happen. It doesn't really matter what comes out of there, right? I guess if this guy's my lawyer, then this company in the UK, the first thing I say is, okay, you're going to put a little plaque on this thing. It's going to give 2 sentences explaining what's going to happen when they sit here, and be done with it. Just in case that unreasonable person or whatever it is, the person, actually probably the normal person out there that such as my parents, they would walk up to say, oh, that's a pretty blue bird. And they wouldn't think twice about what was going to happen when they sat down.
And which phone did we decide is coming with the disclaimer now that says that it is taking your location data?
It's all the Verizon phones. Yeah. All the Verizon phones.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, our tip of the week, I'm having a hard time sort of couching it. It's sort of a twofold tip. There are 2 things to be learned from this story. Number 1 is if you have the copyright in something that is used at popular sporting events, that's a good thing to have, and you should probably get in touch with various venues where they're playing your copyrighted clip, because you might be able to shake some money out of them, and that's what one person has done, a Florida man named Bobby Kent, who claims to hold the copyright to da-da-da-da-da-da charge. And last year, he sent out letters to every single sporting venue, major league sporting venue in the land. And one of them, the LA Lakers, wrote him a check for $3,000. And you might think that Mr. Kent would then go away at that point. But no, he's actually now sued all the rest of them since the Lakers were the only team to respond. He has gone after all the rest of the stadium venues. He calls his piece Stadium Doodads, and got a copyright for it in 1980. So I guess the second part of this tip has to do with, as people are cautious about singing happy birthday in a way that could get them sued. I guess now we have to worry about charge too. So there you go. That's our tip of the week.
I've always hated the Lakers. Now I just have another reason.
They take this guy off.
Isn't there? Maybe I'm crazy. Shouldn't he go and register with ASCAP or BMI or something and just plug into the compulsory licensing scheme and just? He did. It just didn't work.
He did, and he's suing ASCAP too because he says the ASCAP let him down all those years for not collecting the royalties. So.
Oh yeah, I didn't know about that part of the case. Okay, that makes more sense then. I'm like, why isn't this dude like on a beach just getting his checks in the mail? Like,
yeah, I think
every
that's
other
his
composer.
point.
Exactly. Okay, and our resource of the week comes our way from a very good friend of TWiL and a longtime TWiL panelist, Colette Vogel, who is involved with a site that is concerned with these privacy issues we've been talking about today. It is called Without My Consent, and you can find it at withoutmyconsent.org. I'm going to pull up the founders. Let's see, Without My Consent. It itself is a nonprofit organization seeking to combat online invasions of privacy and is concerned with the notion where, you have something embarrassing about you that gets posted in sort of a vindictive way, a vengeful way. And in order for you to combat it, you actually have to associate yourself with that thing that you'd really much rather not, be associated with in order to get any sort of action or result. And so one of the things that they are striving to help people with is to have anonymous plaintiff suits, sort of like if you recall Roe versus Wade, way back in the day, the plaintiff there did not want to be associated with the issue, which was the fact that she had sought and had an abortion. So this sort of flows from that idea. They are striving to help people in these situations. There are a lot of great people involved with it. Ryan Kalo, who's been on the show, Violet Blue, Marsha Hoffman from the EFF, lots and lots of good folks, Jason Schultz, and of course our friend Colette. So withoutmyconsent.org is out there to help you if you find yourself in this unfortunate situation or a friend does. They have resources for victims, for attorneys, and basically are still building out the site, and we hope to get a couple of them on to talk about it in more details when it is more ready to go. Evan, you and I have talked about this issue a lot. Any thoughts about Without My Consent before we go ahead and wrap the show?
Well, this is great. It's a wonderful idea. I get so many calls, as I'm sure you do too, and anybody who holds themselves out as a lawyer who practices internet law, whatever that may mean, gets so many calls from people who are aggrieved that just either don't have a strong enough case to make a lawyer interested in it, or just simply don't have the funds to finance a lawsuit. So this is a wonderful service. I hope that it can get the funding that it needs to be meaningful, so that there actually are people available to take on these cases. Just want to give props to Erica Johnstone, one of the founders there. It looks like she and Colette, have been very instrumental in this. Erica was used to be with my firm, Hinshaw and Culbertson, until a few years ago. So she's just she's great. So just want to give props to her for doing this as well. This is awesome stuff.
Yep, good that they are out there fighting for folks' rights. So that's what we try to do here on TWiL, is let you know what your rights are and how to think about them, or think about them in ways that you might not have before. And I'm really, really grateful to have had this great panel of folks here with us today to do so. Nilay Patel, wonderful having you on the show.
Yeah, always good to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Any other conferences or speaking deals that you're going to have where you look unlike your co-panelists, and do you want to plug?
As long as you put me in academic situations, I'm going to stick out like a sore thumb, I guess. No, nothing big on me. I'm breaking down the Samsung reply. That'll be in This Is My Next today. Not the reply, the counters to. That'll be in This Is My Next today. And then, I'll be around, and we're launching our new site in the fall. So check that out when that happens, I guess.
Fabulous. We look forward to that. And of course, Nilay is at Reckless on Twitter and perhaps elsewhere on the web. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Also back with us today, Matt Macari. Matt, you were wonderful. Thank you so much.
Oh, you bet. Thanks.
Folks can find Matt at iMacAZ on Twitter, and SumIPLaw, that's SumIPLaw.com, is his firm. Thanks a lot,
and I
Matt.
have another thing I'm working on is
Sure.
It's not up yet. Well, it'll probably happen sometime mid-May, towards the end of May, but I'm doing a blog on litigatingapple.com. It'll be Litigating Apple also on Twitter. And it's going to be a review, and not so much just specifically looking at the ins and outs of all the cases from a Apple Corporation perspective, but it's going to be looking at these cases to kind of hash out some of the IP issues that always come up, because these are great cases, and as Nilay's article points out, there's a lot of really interesting things that can go on in these cases. So I'm going to use that as kind of the cornerstone or the template to gives me at least the opportunity to look at some of these issues and blog about them. So mostly on the patent side, but there'll be some other IP issues as well. But it's going to be since basically any issue you can think of comes up in these cases, that's what I'm going to use as the template to do that.
That's great. We look forward to that. And I have to have you explain for us, because I'm not sure, sort of dimly behind you. Is that an Apple II?
That is a Mac Color Classic. Last time I was on, I had my 20th anniversary Mac, so I'm just kind of breaking out pieces of the collection.
Oh, it's wonderful. You have to show us your whole museum sometime.
Yeah, most of it's in storage, but I'll break them out every time, but something different.
Cool. Thanks so much. And Evan, great to chat with you as always.
Yes, the same. Yeah, this has been awesome. It's we have smart people on every week, but this one was so much fun because we talked about so many things and such great perspective. So I've had a blast. Always a great way to spend Friday.
Yep, me too. And folks, you can find Evan. His wonderful technology law blog is internetcases.com, and he is Internet Cases on Twitter. And with that, we will wrap the show until next week, episode 110. Between now and then, you might want to visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/thisweekinlaw, where we post up topics that we're going to discuss on the show. You can always check out our discussion points in progress and for past shows at delicious.com/thisweekinlaw, at least for the time being. Not sure what will happen to the Delicious domain when the Avos people take over, but for now they're there. This one would be thisweekinlaw/109. Also, if you're listening live, then you have joined us at 11 Pacific, 1800 UTC, which is when we record every Friday. That's at live.twit.tv. Or you can always get the show, too, in iTunes and various other distribution channels. You can, of course, download the video and audio directly from our show page at twit.com/TWiL. So thanks, everyone, so much for joining us. Do shoot me an email if you have anything you think is interesting and that we should discuss. I'm Denise at twit.tv. And until next week, we will see you. Bye-bye.